Hello, I'm Reed Riggs.
I'm Diane Neubauer,
Do you want to lead off
and
today's episode, Diane?
I will be leading today's episode. We're going to try a little bit of a different thing. We've discussed articles indirectly before, but this time we're going to talk through a book chapter. If you're watching this on video, this is the book. It's called Teaching English as a Second or Foreign Language in the fourth edition now. This is, I think, it's 2024. Fourth edition. There are three different editors. So that's Marianne, Celce-Murcia, Donna M. Brinton, and Marguerite Ann Snow. And every chapter, and there are a lot of them, there's like over, I think, around 600 pages in this book, on all kinds of aspects of teaching language in general, but thinking of English as either a second language, as in taught in the location that English is prevalent, like the US, like the UK, like Australia, and some other places too, or as a foreign language, and here they mean where it's not a prevalent language locally. So maybe Japan, China, places where the English isn't heard outside of the classroom setting as much. So there are differences between those two, but the idea of the chapter that I wanted to focus on, and then bump ideas off of Reed. Bounce ideas off of Reed.
Both, I think. I don't know.
Was some of the things that, as we were discussing this chapter with students I have in MA programs who are getting a license to be an ESL specialist in K-12 schools in Kentucky. They have this class with me using this textbook. And one of the chapters that was from a previous iteration of the course. So I took it up as a new chapter to me too. Although I'm somewhat familiar with it, but the chapter is number 34 in this book. And it's called Language Learner Strategies and Styles by James E. Purpura. And I know him as kind of I think an assessment person. I think he's written and studied about assessment before, effective language assessments. This one, he introduces some models for how do language learners develop strategies in their learning process. And this can be called strategic competence, like the idea of the learner has this capability of making good choices and good decisions about their learning process, some of which might be big and external, like how they spend their time, but a lot of which could be somewhat unconscious to the learner. They don't always realize it, but it's processing in their mind as they're doing the work of trying to learn a language. And so I found it interesting because these are all models that are designed for language learning in any setting. So they're not about classroom teaching. They're not teaching strategies per se, but they might, as you take a step back and reflect on them, they might then inform teaching practices where you might see a student like maybe is really strong at one of these kinds of strategies for learning, or maybe isn't taking up some strategy for learning, or you're realizing, oh, I'm overburdening them in this way because they only have this much working memory to do XYZ thing. So I think there's some implications for language teaching. One of the things I found in talking with my students online about it was some of them actually thought of these strategies as like, this is how to teach. They're telling us how to teach. And that's not really what's going on in this chapter. So it's a little bit of a step back. It's trying to look at how do learners approach language learning in an effective way? What are those things that they are doing? And so I guess I'll pause here and first bounce something off of you, Reed. Are you familiar with strategic competence or the idea of language learning strategies?
Not as a research history. So it's something that I've thought about as you define it. You're sparking my memories of a lot of things that I've noticed in my students and had conversations about with my students.
Yes.
So that's what I can contribute, I think.
Yeah. And
So
that's
far,
why I picked it,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
knew from talking with you recently, this has been a thing that you've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of teacher conversations relate to this as they're thinking about, how do I help my student, or what's going on here, or
Right.
this student thinks they have to do this, and I know that's not going to help them that much.
Sure.
And so kind of it puts it into more so that you can talk about it.
Right.
So I think there's a place for this kind of thing. So
And yeah, and on the point of your students or your students who are teachers saying, oh, let me just skim this for teaching methods. Let me just skim this for teacher practices. Let me skip over the introduction, skip over the rationale for this, skip over a lot of things. Let me read like a grad student, which is, they are supposed to be doing that. But
skim reading is the right thing to do if you're in grad school.
Yeah,
you
but
cannot read every
for
word
what? You kind of have to skim with intention. And if you're not skimming with the intention that it all matches up with the researcher's intention, with the writer's intention, then you're just going to walk away with a completely different message. So, yeah,
understanding who they're talking to and what they're talking about is not the same context that you might be teaching in.
Right.
So,
you and I have discussed
that,
it's probably
like episode 5 on what can teachers get from research. We talk about this kind of like these are conversations that researchers are having amongst themselves to understand some or another phenomenon related to language or language education or second language acquisition or second language development, or depending on the way that they're phrasing it, they could even have a little bit of a different angle of how they're seeing these same phenomena. But
so quick question about your book. Who do you feel like it's intended for? Who is the audience of your book?
I think it's probably graduate students getting a certification to teach ESL. So I think
it's not purely research to research.
Right. It's more of a research overview kind of a thing. And so it's like if you read anything that's sort of like I was going to call it an anthology, but that's not the right word. Like those kind of books that are all about different aspects of teaching, and they're different chapters by different people who have specialized knowledge. Like they are researchers in that field. Yes, they might also be language teachers or formerly were language teachers, but they're not talking about pedagogy and the classroom practices entirely. Even when they talk about that in a lot of the chapters in this book, they're taking a step back of like, what has been the whole swath of time and what do different things do for language learning and this sort of thing. So
having that in mind, for a room full of teachers reading these books, then I would think that explicitly telling them, this is how researchers talk about classrooms. It's often that they're using the classroom as a data site, a data collection site.
Right. So it's about classroom teaching sort of, but it's not looking at it like classroom teaching. It's not for teachers. There we are.
So then the question as a teacher, what do you take from it? And my first thinking would be, and I'm going to draw from my own experience again, because that's the best I can do for this topic, is you're better understanding what's going on in your learners' minds or what's going on in your learners' process. And some of it's outside their mind. Some of it's, like you said, how they organize their materials, what they spend their time doing, how are they approaching studying. And by understanding that, then you come up with solutions. Then the teacher comes up with solutions. The solutions aren't, you can't say, the student, I think I was sharing with you recently, like if you were to read something like, students waste a lot of time playing video games, it would be absurd to read about that and then say, it says teachers should have students waste their time playing video games. No, that's an observation. The observation is not a recommendation. It's just pointing out some sort of process. And based on that, then you need to come up with, you need to make your own decisions. And I would say it's not the researcher's job to do that because they don't know your context. They don't know your students. And if they did give a recommendation, it probably wouldn't fit. It probably would not fit your exact.
Or it'd be like, here's something to try in something I've heard about that was similar to your situation. Here's some things that could really be worth looking at. I mean, I think you can say something like that as a researcher.
Sure.
I mean, I say that stuff about my
for sure
research for sure, but also other research I've done. So but it's not to say that means this is the thing for all time for everyone.
No, and teachers shouldn't be trying to read this to look for steps. Like, I followed the steps, it didn't work. It's like, no. Take something general from the steps. You could try something from whatever steps, but then you need to be reactive to your situation and aware and seeing what works. And then you'll end up coming up with something. And I've heard teachers say, I came up with my own way, but it's just my own way. So I'm doing it all wrong. And I'm like, no, if you're getting the results you want, then that's exactly what you should have done. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's to my thinking, if you're operating out of good principles, you're going to have myriad possible adaptations to the setting that you're in. And so in talking about like this chapter, as you hear things, that you want to be able to focus in on, yeah, try it out, experiment in your own classroom, be that kind of action researcher in your own classroom setting. So, yeah. So all that's a good preface, I think. One of the sections of the chapter I wanted to focus in on, because it's quite a comprehensive look. I'm actually going to put it on camera, but I might even figure out a way to send this image. So this is from page 538. So you can see this is quite a complex little chart. I'm going to describe that in words, and I'll read a little bit of what Purpura, the author of this chapter, says about it. So we're going to look at Oxford's 2011 model. It's called the Oxford's Strategic Self-Regulation Model of Language Learning. And this is based on a publication from 2011. And this is building off of previous work by Oxford in 1990, where, and I should look up if it's a he, a she, they. I think I'm not going to find that easily. So I'll just refer to Oxford in the generic. So what Purpura says on page 539 about this model, Oxford's 2011 model thus represents a significant reconceptualization of the regulatory function in second or foreign language learning. Regulation is not just about cognitive strategies, mind processes, in other words, but also about affect, so feelings, emotions that someone has, and interaction socially in sociocultural contexts. So Purpura gives a little bit, he goes on to suggest that these are interesting as a model of what learners might do, but he then built his own model that is a little bit more about just the information processing mentally, cognitively. So he wanted to tie in closely to a processing model of second language acquisition for his own model of strategic competence, or the ways in which a language learner might be more effectively spending their time and efforts. But Oxford, I would say, is looking at the whole picture. And I think I might have mentioned this. I like looking at the whole picture too when I'm thinking about SLA, because I'm a language education person. I'm looking at people in classrooms. And so I'm looking at a certain kind of a social setting and how that social setting organizes itself and carries things out, as well as what's happening in the brain of the individual learner, as well as what might be their encounters with language and experiences with language. So I'm thinking about all that too. So maybe that's why Oxford 2011 is appealing to me. So there are two levels at which Oxford describes strategies that a language learner might use. So the first level is the meta strategies for general management and control. So there's like this kind of organizing meta level. So meta being the big picture kind of a thing, not the Facebook company title, but they did that because I'm sure they wanted us to think of them as like, ooh, this kind of overarching thing that determines how you're using smaller processes. Yeah, anyway, so these meta strategies include things, and I'm reading again from page 538 of this book, paying attention, planning, obtaining and using resources, organizing and implementing plans, orchestrating strategy use, monitoring and evaluating. So like self-evaluating, self-monitoring. And there are three categories of these meta strategies that Oxford 2011 talks about. So one is metacognitive strategies. So the cognitive dimension, so helping the learner to manage the cognitive dimension. So their thinking process, their brain activity, their information processing in the cognitive sense. The second one is the meta-affective, and that's AFFECT, affective strategies. So these are ways that the learner is managing their emotional component, their affective dimension, while they are learning a language. And then the third of these meta strategies is meta sociocultural interactive strategies. So these are strategies where how they are managing social interaction as they are seeking to learn a language. And then these three kinds of meta strategies then are then kind of overseeing smaller levels of strategy at the cognitive level, affective level, and sociocultural interactive
Okay.
level.
Yeah.
So I won't go into the details of those yet because I want to
Mm.
pause on
Mhm.
the meta strategies and talk
Mhm.
through that with you.
Mm.
And then maybe we'll go one at a time for the cognitive strategies, the affective, and the sociocultural, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
Okay.
So, yeah. So one of the things that I'm not as sure about the way that Oxford did this the meta strategies idea,
Mhm.
like to what degree does this researcher theorize that learners need to be or are aware
Mhm.
of those things? And that's where I wonder, I thought that might be a thing to talk about
When they
because
say
I
meta, when they say meta, are they implying that the learner is explicitly aware of it?
see that I don't think so.
Okay.
And I should double
They
check
might
if I'm
just mean
skimming
meta as
scan.
like the large category, like the large bucket, to fit the smaller practices, or
Right.
mental processes, um,
Yeah.
or affective things. And so maybe meta is a kind of a odd term here. I'm not, maybe it's assuming that I'm supposed to assume what it means.
Right.
My best guess is that it just means it's the bigger part and then it's got smaller parts in it, but it's not about is the learner aware or not aware.
Yeah, it's not so much about awareness. I think I just found another section.
Okay.
It's also reconceptualizing the 1990 version of it where, and it's a she, the researcher I see now with a pronoun in the text.
Okay.
So Oxford had direct and indirect strategies is the way that she talked about them in 1990, but she's
Mm,
reconceptualized them as like a meta strategy
okay.
and then different specific smaller strategies. So there's like the
Hmm.
meta strategies are like the ones that organize and
Sure.
strategically choose from.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, not
Like,
interestingly though,
yeah.
in the 1990 version of this, she used a survey. It's a survey called the Strategy Inventory for Language Learners,
Oh, that's interesting.
and
Okay.
that's been widely
Hmm.
used. So
Hmm.
it's it says here, adapted for use with different types of language learners to increase their awareness of strategy use.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
idea is like it can be
All right.
helpful. Maybe you weren't aware of what you were doing, but ooh, tap
Yeah.
into that one, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I could see all of these being helpful because I see these problems among my students. I definitely see affective issues. I can think of two specific students who like routinely talk about being nervous. Like they'll say, I don't know what's going on. And they'll skip assessments. They'll just not show up that day. The school counselor, oh no, three students now. School counselor has reached out about a different one and saying, yeah, can you just like cancel some assignments? Like we got to get the student back in the room. Like the student will not come back in the room because they're afraid of
Yeah,
like they're missing out on work and they're not doing as well
yeah,
as their classmates. There's a lot of just I would call that the affective stuff because it's all about their feelings and their anxiety.
yeah,
So so having direct conversations about a fourth one now. I thought a fourth one whose parents reached out to me and said he says he'll never catch up to his classmates. His classmates are
mm,
really strong and he'll never be that strong. And then I had to say, well, can you share with your child um those classmates go above and beyond. Like they're not at the
they're not at
top.
the
They're not at
standards
they're not
level
at
or
the top of
something.
my
They're
standards. They're
pushing
way above my standards, and I don't expect
it.
anyone to be like them. I've had to tell my other students. I have two in the IB system. We call them ab initio. So for 11th and 12th grade, it's like a 2-year AP course. It's called the diploma program. And for Mandarin, we split it into 3 levels. Ab initio means from the beginning, and then standard level is standard level, and then high level. I don't have any high level students. But I have two ab initio. And ab initio means they've just come in and they're studying for an intense test about a year and a half later, almost 2 years later. So they have to
Yeah,
like hit the ground running. It's like really hard. And we only really want students who are willing to do the kind of work that would require that. And so
yeah, yeah. It's this
they
extreme commitment to get to the
yeah,
IB test. That's a tough
yes.
test.
Yeah, and it's a separate test. And I'd say it's about, I don't ballpark a third as hard as the standard level test. But when you see it, it's like, here's a school schedule, get
Oh,
information from the school schedule. It's all these authentic texts and authentic listening. It's not fully authentic. It's a little bit like reworked for test
yeah.
formatting. It's not an actual recording of people or an actual text.
Oh,
But
so
it's
there's a different ending
Oh,
IB
yeah.
test. Okay, I was thinking they were aiming for the
No.
same test.
No,
Okay,
no.
good, because
Yeah.
yeah, I've heard of that, and it's all handwritten, right? The IB test,
Yeah, for Mandarin, yeah, it's all handwritten for
Mandarin
everybody,
Chinese,
and
so
for
that's
Mandarin,
a
it's
huge
it's
difference.
yeah, it's big.
Huge,
It is big.
huge difference.
So yeah, we're going to spend the final semester just hand copying a lot of texts that they've already read, just to get their Chinese character writing fluent, like
Fast.
more
Yes.
fast and
Yes.
ready.
Right. Yeah. Because
But
otherwise, I mean, you could just run out of time because
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah, it builds other things, like it's a kind of direct input to output kind of thing. If you copy text that you've already read, so
Mhm.
you understand them, or ideally you understand them, and you're
Yeah.
getting little sentence chunks that you can write, whip off in your hand really quickly.
Right.
And so anyways, so the first student who went up is like one of my top standard level students, who just did this flawless presentation of pictures that represented text that we'd read. And the ab initio student said, "Do we have to be as good as that?" And I just turned around and kind of jokingly said to the whole class, I said, "No," and I said the student's name who just presented. I said, "Nobody needs to be up to the standard of this." I said her name, and she was smiling and like kind of gleefully accepting the praise. But I was like,
Like,
"She goes
thank
above
you
and
very
beyond.
much. Yeah.
None of you need to be up to her. She's far above any standard I would set for anybody else. So please don't hold yourself up." So
Yeah.
simultaneously, a kind of tongue in cheek praise for
Hmm.
her, and telling everyone else, honestly, don't let those feelings get to you. So I could see
Yeah.
I could see a place definitely for explicitly helping students be aware of the emotions that are normally attached to language study and language learning and language acquisition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And how you feel about yourself as a member of this target language community
yeah,
now.
yeah,
Welcome to the community.
yeah,
You know, it
yeah,
really, and all of those are things that are relevant and can make you freeze
yeah,
or fight
yeah.
or resist or
If
yeah,
the
even
impact
leave
was
the
that,
room
like,
like some of you.
yeah,
Yeah.
if I saw that like anytime we talk about feelings ever, it makes students freeze up, then I would say, oh, we shouldn't talk about feelings. I see the opposite though. Like it really helps
Mhm.
students loosen up, and the effect is the effect the effect on affect is
Yes.
it just shows to be really positive every time. Like I would advocate getting good at talking about feelings with
Yep.
your students. You're talking about managing emotions,
Yeah.
and that's tied to
Yeah.
expectations. It's tied to learning outcomes and performance outcomes, like how you study for something. That's going to be a different process, maybe part of the sociocultural, just meaning how you interact with people around you,
Mhm.
and also the sort of mental processes, which is other conversations I have
Yeah.
with my students. I've caught them. Should I go on about that one?
Yeah, if it's kind of the meta level, we might get
Yeah,
to it with the cognitive strategies too,
it's
because it gets
both.
a little more specific. So,
It's both. Let's wait.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, but I agree. I agree. And I think some of the ways, particularly in talking with the people I've taught online who are adults, I would say adults tend to compare each other and then they get anxiety about it, or they might not even be comparing because they know, oh, I'm brand new, but that person has been working with Chinese for a year and a half already, so it's okay for me to not have that, but maybe I'm behind anyway, and then they get anxious about that kind of issue, and I think it makes them less able to absorb what's going on in the classroom, but it's also they're missing the enjoyment of language
yeah,
learning and knowing that it's a little more of a messy process, that accuracy is not the only thing, where they're first for the ability to communicate, and that includes interpreting meaning from
yeah,
what you hear and what you
yeah.
read, and that's the basis from which your own productive ability is going to happen, and like giving them
Sure.
a sense of that framework. I guess
Yeah,
in some ways that's kind of, I think, maybe a metacognitive strategy that I've used. It's just
yeah,
helping students like look at, this is the process, this is what you can expect, so when you feel weird or
yeah,
when you have the question like, oh wait, am I not getting what I need to be getting, or I feel like I can understand you well, but I can't produce what you're saying.
yeah.
Like,
That
that's
happened.
normal beginner
Yeah,
learner,
yeah,
and like
yeah,
helping them know.
yeah.
To me, that's
And
meta level
it is,
stuff.
and all of these things are I see them as distractions. Like you really, what you want to be spending your time doing is paying attention to language usage, so form and meaning and context. Like those are the three things you should just be like happily washed in,
Yeah.
is form and
Yeah.
meaning and context. And it's totally fine to have lots of moments where you go, oh, that's, oh, you can say that word in this context. Oh,
Mhm.
they use that word. It's okay to have little moments of conscious attention to form
Mhm.
and context, but also the big discourse that's being built up from that all. Are we sharing story? Are we sharing an evaluation of some bad thing that happened, or are we sharing our emotions or evaluation or something? Like there's all kinds of like actions that are happening through communication that uses language. And if you're distracted by like, ooh, her language is so good, what am I doing? Am I in the right place? Like all those distracting thoughts, then you're not paying attention to form and meaning and context, which is where your attention needs to
The
be if you
language
want to grow in the
really
language.
develops from.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. This reminded me of a little thing that I had a conversation. Can't remember what their response was. I think I've had this a couple times with folks from kind of an ALG kind of a mindset about input and the unconscious mind. They're in ALG or automatic language growth. That approach to teaching is they very strongly emphasize an immersive like environment for experiencing this new language without reference to the first language of the learner, because at least as I've heard it explained by a couple folks who use ALG kinds of methodology, their concern is that you're getting the conscious mind to interrupt the really good process, which is all unconscious. And my thought was, the conscious mind is there. You can't turn it off, but you can learn to manage it. And so you can give something to the conscious mind to do, and that isn't going to interrupt the process of language acquisition by doing things like what you were just referencing, like where, oh, I felt this way about it. Oh, right. I remember the teacher said that that's really a common thing for learners, or that kind of thing. Like learning to manage your own thinking, your own feeling, and your own interacting. Like, oh, I feel anxious about going to talk to that person, but I really want to hear what they have to say. So I'm going to go up anyway. And like overcoming those kinds of things.
I would imagine that like the ALG recruiting process includes explanation of the process, like explanation of the method, that they wouldn't have people just come in and be like, we're not going to tell you anything at all because we want nothing at all in your mind when you sit down and just start. Because what would probably happen then is adults who are the ones taking those courses would say, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's am I in the wrong place? Like, am I in the wrong level? Like, this is too hard. What's going on?
I'm not understanding everything, and you're not making me talk to my partner. So what's going on?
So you have to make that all clear beforehand. So those are also meta which of the three stuff, metacognitive strategies, maybe conscious metacognitive strategies.
Be conscious that they are trying to help you not think consciously about language as you're in the classroom.
And that now it's meta.
I mean,
that's what I call meta.
Where my thinking about that is like if somebody's going, like you pointed it out, like where if somebody's going, ooh, why are they using that word there? Or that kind of thing. Like if I have a student that asks me that question, I'm going to give them a quick answer rather than a shutdown, because I don't mind using our shared language. And I think that's not going to harm the progress. That could help because it's going to remove that distraction. It's going to satisfy that little itch from the conscious mind that's like, I'm going to analyze this.
Yeah, sure.
Great. That's a curious mind, and that's a good thing. So dive into the cognitive strategies. You ready?
Sure.
Okay. So that's the first of the categories here. So in this sub-level that's being managed by these meta strategy level stuff, the cognitive strategies listed in condensed form here are ways that help the learner to construct, transform, and apply second language knowledge. And then there are 6 points underneath that. The first, using the senses to understand and remember.
Okay.
Should I pause there?
Sure. No. I'm processing, so I'm
okay. I don't want to stop me if you've got. Oh, I've got a thing. Okay. And otherwise, I'll maybe revisit the list a little bit.
Sure.
So using the senses to understand and remember. Number 2, activating knowledge. Number 3, reasoning. 4, conceptualizing with details, like analyzing, comparing, etc. 5 is conceptualizing broadly, synthesizing, summarizing, etc. And then 6 is going beyond the immediate data, so guessing, predicting, etc. Sounds like inferencing might be there too. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting list.
So it's what
I was expecting.
What I'm wondering about that is, are they referring more to language form or to discourse meaning, because a lot of those sound to me like it would be predicting what's going to be talked about next, like what in the story or the topic is going to come up next.
Hmm.
Or it could be even we call pragmatic actions or social actions. Things like, is the person going to show surprise next? Is the person going to ask a question next? Is the person going to answer the question that was just asked? Those are still like really focused on meaning, bigger meaning. And then if it's like, oh, should a verb follow that subject? Or,
Yeah.
is this going to be a double object construction, which to me would be mostly unconscious processes. So I'm not, they probably do explain it, but at first blush, I'm not sure. I think we do both all the time. We predict form and we predict meaning during online processing, like while hearing or reading in real time. We're
Yeah.
always making a prediction of like which word will come next, like the actual word form
Yeah.
that will come next.
Yeah. And
Um,
maybe not consciously aware that we're doing it.
no,
But that's the way that our minds work.
yes, yeah, we're
So,
always predicting,
yeah.
and that's not just language.
Mhm.
That's
Right. Right.
everything in
Yeah.
our
It's not
environment.
like,
Yeah,
I think she's going to do what, no,
no,
it's more like, the word the appeared, mind doing
yeah. Now I'm
calculations.
expecting
What's
a
a
noun.
noun?
Yeah, a noun next. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's not there, then I'm expecting it to come later and I'm kind of waiting for it. I give my students the example because in Chinese we have these de phrases and they're very much what we call garden path sentences where you're like, there's a sentence, 我很喜欢吃妈妈做的菜. And my students will
Mhm.
read one word at a time in order and they're like, 我很喜欢吃妈妈. And like, I like to eat mother. And I'm like,
Yeah.
hold on, it's a de phrase. A de phrase
Yeah.
is a description.
Keep
You
going.
need to keep
Mhm.
going, and then you're gonna hit the word. So it's 很喜欢吃妈妈做的. I like to eat mother cooked food. And so it's food is the main. I like to eat what? I like to eat food. And then I'll kind of put my fingers up on the board to say, this is the de phrase. It's marking what's describing food. And in English, we could do it if you say, I really enjoyed yesterday's wonderfully planned, beautiful, elegant, extremely eye-catching, uh, uh, memorable, and you just keep going. And you're waiting the whole time
What?
because the words at the beginning, I really enjoyed, you're still expecting a certain kind of word that hasn't resolved it yet.
Appeared.
Yeah. And then I could end
Yep.
it with like banquet. And you go, oh, okay. Oh, it was a banquet.
Yes.
Oh, it was a
Yeah, I
banquet
was
the whole
like,
time.
please say a
Oh,
word
you
there.
got to say, I'm waiting.
Yeah.
Like my brain is still trained to wait.
Like waiting
And
for the other
so,
shoe to drop. Yeah.
exactly. And so that's what Chinese sentences do to you all the time is you're like,
Yeah.
oh, well, 可以, blah, 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 something. And then I go, oh, okay. Because the next
Yeah.
word doesn't
Word
make
order.
sense for the previous word. And so, yeah, we are always doing that. I point them out in class, not to teach it, but to clarify meaning
Yeah.
in the moment. It's like, I need
Likewise,
you to
me too,
understand
because they're
this
so
sentence.
easily misinterpreted.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
every language is going to have some kind of thing that could do that, where you'd easily mistake it because of something that's maybe different from the student's first language. Maybe it's just something where it's harder to do as a beginner because you're working mentally so hard to just understand. And if you, like your students were, just reading one at a time and trying to build up the meaning when
Yeah.
it's actually, you're going to have to go non-linear a little bit in the
Yeah.
way to understand that sentence. Get the whole picture and then interpret more accurately.
I could
Yeah.
share some paraphrased quotes that I've collected of things my students said that to me revealed what they were doing in their minds, and then I had to have
Yeah.
conversations with them. So I
Oh, I
kept
love
them on
it.
a little web page here. I have 5 of them so far. Now these were written months, possibly a year after they were said. So these are not quotes, but
Mhm.
the general thing here is what I wrote
Thinking.
down. So here, after nearly a full semester of handwriting essays in Chinese characters every 2 weeks on average, one student said, I'm writing a lot for this class, but I don't know what any of it means. And then I, as the teacher, said, you don't learn the words you don't learn what the words or sentences mean. And then another student said, it's just a bunch of lines. It says Chinese strokes. It's
Yeah.
just they were
Wow.
somehow memorizing all these characters and not doing
Without
the extra
connecting to
work.
meaning.
Yeah, not doing the extra work of understanding what it meant. And I didn't see any
Wow.
learning. Those characters, the most common characters like to have, and the character duh is the most frequent. It's like a little of, it's like saying of, um, the super duper frequent. And they kept acting like they'd never seen it before when it came up in texts. And I was like, you're writing it a lot and and
Yeah.
you're seeing it a lot. What's going on? So I started to realize that meaning is not being connected and that's a big, big barrier to
Hmm.
learning and development.
Yeah.
Can you check this number 2? Can you check my essay? The teacher said, I'll need you to read your writing out loud before we can discuss it. And the student said, I can't do that. And the teacher, so I said, well, any work you turn in needs to represent your understanding of what you wrote. And the student said, I could tell you if I look at the English version I wrote first. And the teacher, I said, again, any work you turn in needs to represent your understanding of what you wrote. Go back and learn the meaning of what you wrote.
Yes.
And they started, that was the turning point. That was near the beginning of my second semester with my 9th graders. These are pretty much all with my 9th graders 2 years ago, so my current juniors. And that was having those conversations out loud in class helped start pushing students
Yes.
around.
Right, because these are all about these strategies that they've done to kind of avoid learning language,
avoid
essentially.
meaning. And if you're avoiding
Yeah.
meaning, then you're not learning
You're
language, I would
not-
say. Like
you're
you're not
not
acquiring
developing another
language, you're not developing a language. There's nothing, you're not even learning in any sort of like traditional grammar-based sense. Like there's literally,
Right.
and when students will say like, oh, you know, whatever we learned, or teachers will say this, whatever they learned, they forget a few months later. And
Yeah.
I'll say, hold on, if they didn't understand the meaning of it at the time, I wouldn't say they ever learned it. Like
Yeah, I
that wasn't
agree.
learned to begin with.
Right. It
Let's
was something
see.
that was language-like. It was some sort, like, I think that's a Bill Van Patten
Yeah,
term, right? The
language-like. It was
behavior.
forms. It was strings of
Yeah.
forms. But to the
Yeah.
student, it had no meaning. So what was there to learn? There was nothing learned to begin with. Number 3, ask a question in Mandarin about the presentation content. The student gave a presentation, ask a question. Student gives no response. Teacher says, what did I just ask you in English? And the student said, I didn't learn the English for my presentation. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? It means you didn't learn the meaning. And we are getting to meaning through English in a lot of our Mandarin stuff. We don't have cognates. And if they don't have a foundation to talk about meaning in the target language, then that's what we're going with. Especially when we're clarifying sort of questions, sentences in the abstract.
I was just looking at Martina Bex's the Comprehensible Classroom. She has a post that it's called something along the lines of how to teach such that they understand. And there's an infographic. And one of the points that she makes about helping people understand language is linking to meaning to L1, to the first language of the student. And so, yes, absolutely. That's one, but it's like one of 20 strategies she's got listed there.
Yeah. And I think that's often misunderstood is that English is also form meaning connections. Like English, you're not linking it to the English forms and that's it. You're getting to the meaning through the English forms. Like
when
you've
already attached meaning to those forms.
That's right.
In a specific context.
In those contexts. So English is one way to access meaning. And there are definitely other ways, but if your students are, back to the affective part, if they're showing that they're dejected and they're frustrated, and in that moment, I don't want to add more frustration, then I'm not going to try to resolve it in the target language because I prioritize their affective well-being and participation, which I've lost in the past through them being just saying, I don't know what's going on. And then they stop showing up to class. Like we have bigger institutional reasons to not
do other things.
Push through in the target language at certain times. Yeah.
Hey, I see that there's less than a minute left, but I'd love to get to the rest of your students' comments because those are fascinating. But also the effective strategies and the sociocultural interactive strategies.
Why don't you end with those? Mine are pretty much the same. It's like I'll skip to number 5 here. After finishing a presentation, and 2/3 of it so far, the student finished 2/3 of the presentation and then said, did I talk about the trains yet? This is in English. And I said, you did. And the student said, and did I talk about the New Year's Eve meals yet? And I said, you did. And the student said, did I get to the part about the banquet? And I said, you did. And the student said, okay, I'm past the part where I thought I was. Wow. So there's a lot of speaking and not knowing what the meaning of any of it's memorizing sound forms.
Yeah. And I know this wasn't what you're trying to teach them to do at all. This is just their own, or like to come out of this with so thinking in terms of, if I do this assignment, what I need to do is vocalize sounds that my teacher will grade. I don't need to actually have language proficiency behind it. But it's very interesting, like that the way that students' minds work, that they ultimately think, I think sometimes this is an easier path. When in the long run, it's not. No. It's not, because they're held up to this exam at the end of their experience at your school.
So I've shown them, I've shown them images of like staircases going up where it's like I found some random word clouds on Google Images of Chinese character or Chinese word clouds. And so I made a little staircase where the bottom row is the same word cloud. And then the second column, it's the same word cloud that goes on the second row up. And then the third row up is the third word cloud. It's the same every time. So basically what you see is it's like the words that you are going to be, exposed to at the beginning of your studies, those are included in your next year of studies. And I call them the different columns, or time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. And so
when
basically
you use the word go the first year of your language study, you're still using it the next year.
That's right.
Yes.
And so what I tell my students is
learning it once is easier.
If you it's more of a message to my students who already care a lot and do a lot of hard work. For the other ones, that's a separate problem and I have to address. Like, I need you to try to do something more basic to just pass this course. But for the ones who care, I'm like, the way you're approaching this work is not allowing any of these little word clouds to form. And you're going to find yourself later saying, why do I have a text? The way I make my vocabulary list, I'm going to stop doing this. I found something even better. The way I was doing this is for every new text I introduced, I would make a vocabulary list through a machine software that would take every word in the list and make a vocab list. And so it's not like most textbooks where it's like, they already know all the words, but here's just the new words. Like, you don't know what they know. Students, study different, have different memories. So here's the entire vocab list. My seniors last year were asking, why are we learning 200 new words? And I would say it's not 200 new words, except it kind of is for you because you've been like not attentive and not keeping up. And so I'm sorry, but these are the texts that the IB test is asking for. And that's what we have to be ready for. So do your best. It was very discouraging to them. But telling my other students, hey, here's my little ladder visual. Please make sure that you're, you can always check yourself. If you can read a text that we've read before, and you say, oh, I understand 90% of it. That's a measure. That's one way to measure how well you're doing in this language. If you pick up that text and you understand none of it, that's also a measure of how well you're doing in this language. Like, you check yourself. So I think that having conversations about what's going on, like where your attention is going, I think that's how I'd frame it. It's like having conversations about where to put your attention. Are you paying attention to meaning? And I've had my new ab initio students who are, they're there because they knew what the workload would be. They're good at studying. They kind of shared with me, they're like, I'm able to write all of the essay I need to write. I can say about 2/3 of all the characters. I know how to say them. I still need to go back and be able to say all of them. And I know what they all mean though. And I was like, okay, you're on the right track and you're aware. Like, you're showing me your awareness of that. So I think these are helpful strategies in practice.
Yeah. Shall I read off affective?
Yeah,
the little
let's
list.
Do it.
Yeah. So she has just 2 in that category, but that these affective strategies help the learner create positive emotions and attitudes and stay motivated. So the first area is activating supportive emotions, beliefs, and attitudes. So some of the things that I was saying, I think she would count as an affective strategy rather than the meta affective strategy. Maybe that's just the awareness of I'm feeling anxiety, which now I draw on some kind of, remember, this is a process. It's not perfect yet. Remember, proficiency isn't about, total accuracy. This is about getting messages across. Something. So things like that, I think those are the kinds of messages you're reminding. The second kind of affective strategies, generating and maintaining motivation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, I hear this a lot from adults who are independent language learners.
Yeah.
Like, how do you maintain
stay with it?
motivation?
You stay
how
with
do you
it.
stick with it?
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, don't fight that battle. Do things you like. And
it's hard in schools.
Enjoyable in school.
It's hard in schools. It's hard for teachers oftentimes. And I hear this from teachers. They're like, I just don't know what's going to, and often even at conferences, I'd hear teachers say things like, ooh, this game, my students will love that. And I kept thinking, but is it good? Are they gonna acquire language from it? Is it good for their language development? And that was often not the main draw that I would see teachers say like, "Oh, my students will love this." It's like it's always about motivation and engagement. But now that I'm more in the classroom and in a high school
But
classroom, it's like
but it's
you
a
have to have that
yeah,
first. You
to
have to
get
have
the
that first.
buy-in
Yeah.
on the things that matter for
Yeah.
real acquisition.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a shout out to Sarah Breckley, who is a Spanish teacher now in Oregon. She gave a great presentation in which she directly said this, and we talked about it afterwards. And I was like, yeah, you have to make decisions in a classroom that are not exclusively about cognitive SLA development,
No.
right?
Yeah.
You are dealing with people with
Yeah.
emotions and desires and interests, and
And
if it's not
distractions.
enjoyable to them,
Right.
they
Yeah.
may not be self-regulating enough or motivated. Like they may not have a reason. I
Yeah.
don't mean like you have to have this great motivation. I mean,
You have to have
they might
enough
not just
motivation.
come to class,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you have to make things enjoyable. I look for the things that do both.
Yeah.
Like, is it both enjoyable and it's going to develop their language in some way or another? But some things, they're lighter than
Yeah.
others in terms of maybe what I think the impact might be for their growth in the language. But it's, you can't be on 100% of the time, full bore,
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're
Yep.
dealing with people who are whole, not
Yep.
just
Yep.
a brain in a
Mhm.
box.
Right. Why can't you just be brains in boxes?
Yeah.
You're
They'd
so
behave
frustrating to
better.
me. Yeah. Why can't you just be brains in boxes?
Yeah.
No, so you also
Anyway,
had the sociocultural. I don't think you've gotten to that.
yes,
Let's do that.
right. Sociocultural interactive strategies. And these are defined as things that help the learner interact to learn and communicate, despite knowledge gaps, and deal well with culture. So that's interesting. So there's
Hmm.
3 areas of these.
Yeah.
1, interacting to learn and communicate. So apparently, talk to somebody or
Sure.
do something to interact with somebody, not
Yeah.
necessarily speak. 2, overcoming knowledge gaps in communicating. So
Sure.
like I'm
Sure.
imagining
Yeah.
circumlocution strategies and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And then 3, dealing with sociocultural contexts and identities.
I mean, if you're
So
going to be honest and authentic, I think whatever classroom you're in is the sociocultural context that you're in. I don't.
Yeah.
So I see.
yeah, and this could apply outside a classroom in a different way.
Oh, sure,
because
sure. For sure.
Mhm.
And in an ESL context, we're often talking about, they're in the UK or they're in America or Australia, learning English in a classroom or not in a classroom at all. But either way, once they go outside the classroom, they're dealing with a different culture depending on what culture
Yeah.
they're coming from.
Yeah, and possibly dealing with how do those folks view this language learner because of
That too.
race or ethnicity
That too,
or
yeah.
accent or
For sure.
age or any number of factors that
That's right.
about their identity and
Yeah.
that may be not entirely within their control. So
Yep.
having to cope with that too.
Yep. There's a lot. So for me as a Chinese language teacher in the United States, I often talk about the culture of my classroom. It just means whatever community norms we have in our classroom, built around the specific people that have made those community norms. When we talk about culture in this sense, I'm not thinking about culture in terms of the target, the target language culture, which would be like Chinese communities in mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, overseas Chinese communities. That's just not our classroom. If we had some members from those communities in our classroom, we could
Then
make
it's more relevant.
Yeah, we make more relevant. We could make it more connected to that. But no, it's always in the abstract. The best I can do is that my students will sometimes say, "Oh, I interacted with a Chinese person while traveling," or I went to Chinatown this weekend. That's actually never happened, but I wish it would.
Yeah.
But or I was playing an online game and some Chinese people somehow came into our game and we're talking to each other and I just listened in. Or a student just said, and her mom works at the school and told me, they both each independently told me how excited they were that my student was at a ballet rehearsal and there was a teacher of young children there speaking purely Chinese to the young children and she could understand everything. She understood 100%.
Cool.
She felt like 100% what the teacher said and she was so excited to come back and say, I was so excited to understand them. Oh, and she has an in-law uncle from Taiwan and she was having a dinner conversation in Chinese. Those things I can bring into the classroom that are connected to actual outside target language culture communities.
Yeah.
But other
well,
than that,
to
yeah,
connect to, we just talked about culture in a recent episode too. I think you can create little tastes of that and bits of that kind of development of intercultural competence by showing things from the target
for sure.
language
Yeah,
communities too.
videos and stuff.
So they might become aware of like, I expected this or that thing, or I'm seeing this kind of behavior in this video. Why do they do that? And
Yeah.
developing the curiosity
Mhm.
and the withholding of the judgment. I think you can still do that.
For sure.
And that would be part of sociocultural adaptation too.
Okay, okay, yeah. When that text is relevant, how we interact with that text, and text here
Yeah.
means video and
Yeah.
pictures and
Yeah.
stuff too.
And
For sure.
thinking in terms
Yeah,
of your
yeah.
own responses too. Like,
And those become
yes.
classroom norms. Ideally, we develop classroom norms around showing respect when viewing some kind of text, video, etc. Yeah, for
Yep.
sure.
Yeah.
Yep, that has come up. Yeah, that came up more in the last episode, I think, about culture. But other than that, I have students who will, I had to tell them about 2 years ago, when I ask you a question, I'm not testing you. Like they would kind of freeze up,
Mhm.
and I had to just explicitly tell them, I'm always going to interact with you because I need you to be exposed to language, but I also need to kind of see what you're quick at and what you're less quick at and what you don't seem to know at all, so that I can adjust around you, so that I can say it a different way, so that I can
not
help you,
to
so that I
judge
can
you,
provide.
but to
No.
be able to interact better with you.
And I think they weren't used to that. So I had some students who would kind of freeze up, and they would say things like, "Oh, I'm really afraid of speaking." And I think by speaking, they didn't mean them producing language. They meant interacting in a spoken mode, in a spoken channel,
Yeah.
which even if it's just listening, and even if it's just a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of response kind of question, they call that speaking, but it's what they mean is like interacting through spoken mode. And so is by having a conversation with them and saying, "Oh, just to let you know, I will be asking lots of questions. It's not a test, and it's not like showing disappointment if you don't know it. It's
Right.
a lot of it's designed around things that you don't know, so that we can establish some new topics, so that I can support you in new ways. Please don't ever expect that I'm testing you when I just talk with you." Yeah.
Yeah. Likewise, I had the same kind of thing with students. Let's see, they were I'm thinking especially the second year Chinese class that I inherited, who had a different teacher for year one. And I would do that. I would recast, or I don't even think they were recasts. They were just repeating and maybe augmenting what the student said. And they would like listen because they're like freezing, like, oh no, I must have said it wrong. Wait, what did I thought and they get like these puzzled looks and these kind of frozen up, like, and I finally realized like, oh no, I just need to tell them like, look, you need a lot of input.
Yeah.
And so I'm modeling the way that you spoke and building on it so that I can continue to talk with you at a level that you're getting a little bit more from what I'm saying. And so that helped, but it took them a while to adapt to that was the way we're going to interact here. It's not about, oh, she's testing whether or not I said it right. And if she said something back to me, it's a correction. It's like, no, we're communicating messages. We're building something here.
And that's kind of the negotiation for meaning that is not often the way it's talked about in like activities designed for negotiation for meaning, but it is like your meaning wasn't the real thing. It wasn't a word level meaning or a sentence level meaning. It was your action, that your teacher action wasn't a correction. Your teacher action was I guess a recast. Kind of, sort of. Yeah. It's like, hey,
it's like
so here's an interesting
input,
idea.
Like to a Michael Long term there, although he was talking about written text, I think. But like the idea of taking something and then building something a little bit more, a little bigger out of it. It's still very clear in its meaning, but it's that's probably different from what he meant by elaborate.
Well, there's a form side to it and there's a meaning side to it. And on the form side, it's like maybe I am saying it in a more grammatically correct, grammatically accurate, or target like, or even more complex way, because I'm trying to give you more accuracy. Yeah.
It was an upgrade. It was an upgrade. I do a lot of upgrades. So it could be adding emotion. And I had this in my dissertation. So an upgrade where the teacher responding to the student might hear the student say yes, or the equivalent in the target language.
Yes.
And the teacher goes, Really?
Yeah.
Wow. You think
Yeah.
so?
Yeah.
Like, so they just said the essence of the same message, but they've upgraded it both
Be
with
more
emotion and
emotion. Yeah.
verbally. They've upgraded to longer phrasing and like all
There's a
that. I
lot of
love those.
form
I
and
love
meaning.
those. I
Yeah.
think that's
That are both
awesome because
upgraded. Yeah.
it's building on the students' maybe beginning levels of proficiency kinds of responses and
Yeah.
then it's building it into something
Yeah.
bigger. And then it can draw in other students as
hmm
you keep going with it.
I
So
do this with
I
my
love
daughter a lot.
upgrades.
So like dinner at night, we'll be having ice cream and there's still a little ice cream in my bowl and my wife's bowl and my daughter's bowl is empty and she's almost this month she'll be 2.5. And so she'll finish. Sometimes she's not even done. She has a little ice cream left and she'll go, um, that one, and she'll point to my ice cream and I'll say, you want this one? And she'll go, okay. And so then I'll kind of, so like, to me, I'm not sure what the okay is. So
Yeah.
I'm not fully able to verify what just happened, but
Yes.
if we take the okay as a confirmation to a request,
Yeah.
she's treating my response as an offer.
Yes.
But I didn't mean for
Yes.
it to be an offer. I meant
You
it to
wanted your
be
ice
a
cream?
clarification request. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it's always this sort of comedic thing. Now, again, in the end, there's no way to verify what she meant by okay. But
Hmm.
if we do treat it as a normal adult, how adult would use okay, then it's funny to see how it
It
gets
is.
sort of like the mismatch in like that one. Oh, you want this one? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a
Yeah.
mismatch in actions on my turn. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that's these sorts of things are just normal, and it's like it's a messy process, but that's where all this language and meaning is provided, and that's where students they just have. In the long run, it's like it's how much exposure did you get? These are all things that provide exposure. Um,
Hmm.
and I guess there's attention as part of it. I don't know that in the super long run, like if our students could have 10,000 hours of just exposure, does it matter where their attention was? It's not really verifiable. It's like for children, you kind of have to just make assumptions that, like, I guess that's the case because we can't verify where their attention was. And they do
Yeah.
end up being adult-like in the long run. And so it seems to be the case for children. We can't really measure it with adults because adults are in all kinds of like isolated contexts and um, a lot of their time with language is their own output. And so I don't know if that's providing a sort of like self-input that reinforces what looks like fossilization in the 80s term.
Yeah.
So
Sometimes. Yeah.
at the end, I like to just be agnostic and say, I don't know. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, on
Well,
that,
this has been
shall we
fun.
call it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, this is the end of season 2, we've
Two.
decided. Yep.
Yes.
So I think we'll do
Mhm.
10 episodes per season. It's an arbitrary number, but why not?
Yeah. Why not? 5 in
Yeah,
season 1, 10 in season 2.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how it
Um,
is. Why
it's
why are we having seasons at all? Well, because we want to, well, I think occasionally we want to revisit like what are we doing here again? Who
yeah,
are we? And
yeah.
kind of starting a season with a
Mhm.
little bit of that
Yeah.
to as we have new people listening. And
This will be a fun way to end. Diane, do you have time to record the first episode of season 2?
I do.
Okay, let's do that right
Yeah,
now.
let's do it. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for listening. You'll get a nice intro in 2 weeks from now when we come back with the first episode of the next season.
Yep.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. I've been Reed Riggs.
Oh, and I'm Diane Neubauer.
Thank you.